Okay.
I had one quick one in my financial naivete, but why did the payments go up and down during the payment schedule? What's the reason behind that? Because usually they just proceed on at a steady pace.
Good question. The answer there is if you look at the between 440, there's always going to be within $5,000 difference between the annual payments. Okay, and that's because bonds are sold in $5,000 increments.
Okay.
So this old bond issue was sold to the public in $5,000 increments, and so you're always going to have some difference there.
Gotcha.
It's not a completely level to the penny amortization.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're ready to hear from Danielle. Eric, thank you.
I think I just need that one right. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Danielle Quaid. I'm with Holly Troxel, which is a law firm that's based out of Boise, but I'm lucky enough to practice out of the Coeur d'Alene office. So I just came down. We talked about if it was down or up. It's definitely down from there. So I am here to talk about the documents. You heard the fun stuff, which is that you're saving money. But there are some documents that go along with that we've been working on and that we've been negotiating with Zions and their counsel. And it's broken into two ordinances for a couple of reasons. The major reason is that my experience with these types of transactions is that wastewater is always going to need additional financing at some time. And in order to keep the documents and the requirements and your covenants consistent, we think that this master ordinance, supplemental ordinance way is the best way to manage that, because the master ordinance contains, and I'll point some of them out to you in a minute, a list of the covenants and the framework for issuing additional bonds, et cetera, that will govern all of your wastewater bond issues going forward. And then the supplemental ordinance just covers things related to this specific bond issue. So that when we go back, like for instance, right now you have these 2008 bonds and then you have 2011 bonds. And not all the provisions between those two ordinances are consistent, which means that your administration has to track and make sure that you're meeting these different covenant type requirements. So once you're still going to have the 2011s outstanding, and we're required to comply with all the covenants and requirements therein. But once those bonds are paid off, we'll be working under a framework where all the bonds are subject to the same requirements. So that's the reasoning for these two different ordinances. So I just want to point out a couple of things to you in each of them that I think are material. Starting with the master ordinance, and you don't have to track this on a page-by-page basis, but the primary thing is that you're pledging the net revenues of the system, right? You're pledging all the revenues you receive less your O&M costs. You have to keep operating the system to keep serving your customers and keep them paying their bills. So we have you do that first, operate the system first, and then the remaining revenues are all pledged to the debt service. If you look at the covenants are in, sorry, I'm losing my little page tabs here. All of the specific covenants related to all of your wastewater bonds going forward are in Section 11, which is on page 19. Probably the most important of those is the rate covenant. So you pledge that you're going to collect wastewater revenues, wastewater rates, to allow you to have 125% of debt service coverage each year. So that's 1.2 times your total debt payments will need to be covered in rates. That's a very typical requirement for wastewater. That just gives you, that gives you the cushion to pay your operations expenses. You're also required to continue to operate the system, to keep it in good repair, to provide your audited financial information, to diligently collect your revenues from your system, to carry insurance, things that would be expected. But the main thing is that you collect that 1.25 times your debt service coverage. In Section 13, you'll find the provisions for issuance of additional bonds. So this is what would govern your ability to issue additional bonds on a going forward basis in this system. It's different from like a general obligation bond if you were seeking such. This is just related to wastewater. But the main thing there is that you're going to have to evidence that you could meet that 1.25 times debt service coverage on your new bonds too. So you have to have revenue to cover that for both, or at least be able to predict revenue if you're increasing service and increasing revenue with your project. If you don't have any questions about the master ordinance, I'll turn to the supplemental.
Everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Danielle, we'll move on, that'll be great.
Okay. So on the supplemental ordinance, as I said, this is the document that governs these bonds specifically. And so the things I want to point out, and some of these Eric covered, but in section 2.06 on page 6, it states that these bonds are subject to optional redemption at any time. So you just give 30 days notice and you can prepay them at any time, which is gives you a great amount of flexibility. I also wanted to point out in section 3.01, which is on page 7, that pursuant to your prior bonds, your 2008 bonds and your 2011 bonds, you used to be required to carry a reserve requirement or hold a reserve fund. That the market has moved away from requiring a reserve fund on wastewater because it is such a consistent and predictable revenue stream. Everyone wants to flush their toilet. They all pay their bills. You can go out and collect against them if they don't. So that reserve is no longer required as much in the marketplace. So as I said, while the 2011 bonds are still outstanding, you'll still have to have that reserve, and we calculated funding that reserve. But once those bonds are paid off, you'll be free of that reserve requirement. And then it goes on a bond issue by bond issue basis. So like Department of Environmental Quality, which is a likely funder for a wastewater project, they do require a reserve. But they allow it to be funded over 10 years. So if you ended up with additional bonds sold in the market, you would not have to have a reserve. If you ended up with a DEQ transaction, you'd have the flexibility to fund it the way they provide you fund it, which is basically paying 110% of your debt service every year. So that's a big change that will give you more flexibility moving forward. Then Section 3.04 authorizes the escrow account. So these bonds, the 2008 bonds, are not actually callable. They can't be paid and redeemed until April 1 of 2018. So the money will be put into an account at the end of December when we close the bond issue and held there in a secure account until the bonds can be paid. And that's pursuant to an escrow agreement with U.S. Bank, who is the trustee on those 2008 bonds. So we're authorizing you to enter into that agreement. And I think I wanted to point out the pledge of net revenues, but we've already talked about that. So that's kind of the meat of the supplemental ordinance. The supplemental ordinance also authorizes you to enter into the bond purchase agreement, which is another document that I believe you have in front of you. That really is the agreement where Zions Bank says, yes, we'll buy all the bonds from you, and you say, we'll sell them to you, and it's subject to certain conditions like the delivery of my bond opinion at the end of the transaction.